Welcome, dear friends, to our channel, a place where we share stories that touch the heart, where family, sacrifice, and love take center stage. If you believe in the power of stories to remind us what truly matters, consider subscribing. It helps this little corner of the internet grow, and it keeps these stories reaching people who might need them most. Tonight's story is called She Gave a Kidney to a Stranger for Her Daughter. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of ring that slices through silence and leaves a room feeling colder than it was a moment before. Margaret, 72, had lived long enough to recognize the difference between a casual call and a life-changing one. This one, she sensed, belonged to the second category. She pressed the receiver to her ear. A doctor's voice, measured, careful, introduced himself. He began with pleasantries, but Margaret barely heard them. She could feel her breath shortening even before he reached the heart of it. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "I'm afraid you're not a viable match for your daughter's kidney transplant." It was like the air left the room. For months, Margaret had lived with the conviction that her body, her blood, her bones could save her child. She had prayed that life would be circular like that. A mother gives life once, and when called upon, she gives it again. But the doctor's words slammed shut that hope. "You mean," Margaret's voice broke, "I can't help her?" "I'm sorry," the doctor replied softly. "Your blood type is incompatible. The transplant would not take. I know this is devastating to hear." Margaret closed her eyes. She thought of Emily, 32 years old, once a bright little girl running in the yard with scraped knees and laughter that filled the neighborhood. Now Emily was pale, tethered to dialysis, her future shrinking to the size of a hospital room. A mother's instinct is to believe in her own hands, to fix the broken toy, to kiss away the bruise, to trade her health for her child's. But this was beyond instinct. It was biology. It was final. Margaret's faith, the kind that had carried her through widowhood and long winters, began to tremble. If her body couldn't save Emily, then what could? Was the system, this labyrinth of waiting lists and policies, strong enough to do it? Or would her daughter simply disappear into the long shadows of statistics? The doctor spoke again. His words were clinical, but they carried the weight of a lifeline. "There is another possibility," he said. "A paired donation program. It means you would donate your kidney, not to Emily, but to a stranger. And in return, that stranger's loved one or another in the chain would donate to your daughter. It creates a swap, a sequence. It's not immediate. It carries risk, but it gives Emily a chance she otherwise wouldn't have." Margaret listened, her hand trembling against the receiver. Donate to a stranger. No guarantee her daughter would receive one in return. Her mind was a battlefield, faith in humanity on one side, fear of losing Emily on the other. The doctor's words echoed. It gives her a chance. A chance, that was all. But for Mother, sometimes a chance is enough to step into the impossible. And in that quiet kitchen, with the ticking clock marking every heartbeat, Margaret whispered the words that would change not only her daughter's life, but the lives of strangers she had yet to meet. "I'll do it." That night, Margaret didn't sleep. The house was quiet, but her mind was louder than it had ever been. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every syllable of the doctor's voice. Not a match, not viable. Another possibility. The words clanged like church bells. She rolled onto her side and saw the empty space where her late husband once slept. Harold had been gone nearly 10 years, but she could still hear him sometimes in moments like these. "Do the right thing. Mags," he would have said, using the nickname only he ever dared. But what was the right thing? The paired donation program sounded noble, even miraculous. A stranger helping her daughter. She helping a stranger, a circle of giving. Yet the program wasn't a promise, it was a gamble. She could go through surgery, risk her life and her health, and there was no certainty Emily would receive her kidney in return. Margaret sat up, swung her feet onto the floor, and walked to the window. The street outside was empty, a lone lamppost casting a pale circle of light on the pavement. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and whispered a prayer. "God, if this is the path, show me the courage." The next morning, Emily called. "Mom, what did the doctor say?" Her daughter's voice was fragile, almost childlike, though she was 32. Dialysis had stolen the strength from her, replacing it with exhaustion. Margaret wanted to lie. to tell her it was fine, that she was a match, that everything would be simple, but mothers don't lie when the truth is the only way forward. They said, "I can't give you mine, honey." There was a pause, the kind that swallows hope. "So, what now?" Margaret's throat tightened. "There's a program. I'd give my kidney to someone else, and then through a chain, you could receive one from another donor." "From a stranger?" Emily's voice cracked. "Yes, from a stranger. It isn't guaranteed, but it's a chance." Emily exhaled slowly, like air escaping a balloon. "Mom, I can't let you do that. What if something happens to you? What if you give yours away and I still don't get one?" Margaret closed her eyes, her hand tightening around the phone. "Then at least I tried. At least I put something into the world that might come back to you." Later that week, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with her son, Daniel. Unlike Emily, he was healthy, strong, and outspoken. He had driven in from 3 towns over to talk some sense into his mother, or so he claimed. "This is madness," he said, stabbing his finger into the table as if it were the doctor's chest. "You're 72, you're not supposed to be volunteering for major surgery. You could die on that operating table." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "I could die crossing the street, Daniel. Don't be glib." "I'm not. I'm being honest. Life is risk, and this is one I'm willing to take." Daniel leaned back, shaking his head. "It's not just about risk, it's about fairness. Why should you give to someone else's family when we don't even know if their family will give back to us? The system could take advantage of you." Margaret met his eyes, steady and calm. "And if it does, then one more person is alive because of me. One more mother doesn't bury her child. One more family doesn't grieve at an empty table. Isn't that something?" Daniel's face softened. He wanted to argue more, but the conviction in his mother's eyes silenced him. For the first time in his adult life, he realized nothing he could say would stop her. On Sunday, Margaret went to church. She sat in her usual pew, the one near the back, close to the aisle. The hymn that morning was about grace and surrender, and she sang with a trembling voice. Afterward, Pastor Lewis greeted her. "You look troubled, Margaret. Heavy burden?" She nodded. "A choice I don't know how to make." The pastor tilted his head. "Sometimes the hardest choices are the holiest ones. When love asks more of us than we think we can give, we find out how much love we really have." Margaret smiled faintly. "And what if love takes everything?" "Then," he said gently, "you'll know you gave everything that mattered." That night, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd fed her children countless meals, where homework had been done, where Christmas cards had been written, where Harold had once read his newspaper with a furrowed brow. She spread the paperwork in front of her, the forms from the hospital, the consent documents for the paired donation program. Her hands trembled as she picked up a pen. The kitchen clock ticked. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked, then fell silent. Margaret thought of Emily, her face pale in the hospital light. She thought of the countless mothers across the country, waiting, hoping, bargaining with heaven for their children. She thought of Harold and the promise she had made at his graveside. "I'll take care of them." Always, she pressed the pen to paper and signed her name. Margaret Harper. With those strokes of ink, the choice was no longer bitter, it was decided. The following morning, she called the transplant coordinator. Her voice was steady, almost serene. "I've signed the forms," she said. "Put me in the program." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then the woman replied, "Mrs. Harper, you may have just saved more lives than you realize." Margaret hung up the phone, her heart heavy yet strangely light. She walked to the window again, looked out at the morning sky. The sun was rising, a pale gold spreading across the horizon. For the first time in weeks, she felt she could breathe. Sometimes love asks us to give directly. Sometimes it asks us to give without knowing where the gift will land. Margaret had made her choice, and from here, the story would only grow larger than her own. The hospital called on a Thursday morning. Margaret had been expecting it, but expectation never softens reality. "Mrs. Harper," the voice said, polite and efficient, "we've scheduled your surgery for next week. You'll need to come in for pre-op tests this Friday. Please bring a family member with you if possible." Margaret thanked the nurse, hung up the phone, and sat very still. She stared at the receiver in her hand as though it had just handed her a sealed fate. Next week, the decision she had made with pen and paper was now becoming flesh and blood. On Friday, Daniel drove her to the hospital. He still hadn't made peace with her decision. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set like stone. "Mom, you know you can still back out," he muttered, eyes fixed on the road. I won't, Margaret answered softly. You don't owe anyone this, not strangers, not even this system that doesn't care about you. Margaret glanced at him. His profile reminded her of Harold, the same square jaw, the same furrow when worried. But Harold had been a man who believed in unseen dividends, the way kindness multiplies even when you never see the returns. Maybe I do owe them, she said, because someone else might be the only reason Emily lives. Daniel said nothing, but the silence between them was heavier than argument. The hospital lobby smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Margaret checked in, was given a plastic bracelet, and led down a hallway that seemed too white too long. A nurse named Claire guided her through the pre-op routine, blood tests, chest x-ray. Margaret moved through each step with quiet obedience, her mind wandering back to Emily. She pictured her daughter's smile when she was a girl, gap-toothed and wide. She pictured her at prom in a pale blue dress, nervously smoothing her skirt. She pictured her last week, hooked to a dialysis machine, pale but still trying to joke, saying, "At least I don't have to do the dishes, Mom." The memory hurt, but it was also fuel. When the testing was done, Claire handed Margaret a folder of instructions. No solid food after midnight before surgery. You'll check in the morning of. You'll need someone to drive you home after discharge, and we'll set up a follow-up appointment 2 weeks later. Margaret nodded, but inside, her thoughts screamed, what if I don't make it home? What if I never see Emily again? That night, lying in bed, she wrote Emily a letter. The pen scratched across the paper slowly, carefully, as though each word might be her last. My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, it means God called me home sooner than either of us wanted. Don't carry guilt. Don't carry sorrow longer than you must. Remember that a mother's love isn't measured by time, but by the pieces of herself she leaves behind in her children. I have given you everything I could, my days, my laughter, my patience, and now my body. Live boldly, M. Laugh loudly, and never forget that my love will outlast even the stars. Mom, when she sealed the envelope and placed it in her nightstand, she felt a strange peace. Sometimes facing mortality isn't about denying fear, but about preparing love to survive you. The morning of admission, the world looked deceptively ordinary. Birds chirped outside her kitchen window. A neighbor waved from across the street. Margaret placed a hand on the doorframe as she left, whispering to herself, "This is the house I may never return to." At the hospital, she was led to a room with pale green walls and a bed draped in stiff sheets. A gown was laid out, and the nurse explained the process. Margaret listened, nodding, though her heart was pounding in her ears. Emily arrived shortly after, escorted by Daniel. She looked fragile, wrapped in a sweater, though the day was warm. Her eyes searched her mother's face. "You're really doing this," Emily whispered. "I am," Margaret replied. She reached for her daughter's hand, pressing it firmly. "Because I love you more than my fear." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She shook her head. "Mom, I don't deserve this. What if it doesn't work? What if—" Margaret hushed her gently. "What if it does?" As the anesthesiologist came in to explain the procedure, Margaret felt her resolve harden. There was no turning back now. The papers were signed. The bed was ready. The doctors were prepared. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. She could almost feel Harold's hand resting on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. She could almost hear his voice, "Do the right thing, Mags." And she knew without doubt that this was the right thing, not because it was safe or certain, but because it was love. Later, as the nurse adjusted her Roman 4, Margaret asked, almost casually, "How many people are usually saved in these swaps?" The nurse smiled kindly. "Sometimes two, sometimes more. It depends on the chain. But one donation can ripple farther than you think." Margaret let that sink in. She had come here for her daughter, but maybe, just maybe, her gift would reach beyond her own family. And in that moment, as the sedative began to take hold, she whispered a final prayer. "Let my small life be a bridge. Let my gift carry someone home." Her eyes fluttered shut. The point of no return had come. And Margaret, a 72-year-old mother, walked into it with courage that outshone her fear. The fluorescent lights above her flickered softly as the gurney rolled down the hallway. Margaret lay flat on her back, the ceiling tiles moving past like frames of an old film. The air smelled of antiseptic, sharp and clean, a scent that always carried both safety and dread. Claire, the nurse she had met earlier, walked alongside her. "We'll be with you the whole time," she said warmly, as though she were guiding Margaret into a familiar place instead of the threshold between risk and hope. Margaret nodded faintly, her lips too dry to speak. The operating room doors swung open, releasing a burst of cold air. The room was bright, almost blinding, with instruments lined neatly on trays, silver gleaming under white lights. Monitors beeped rhythmically, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed indifferent to the human heart it was meant to protect. The anesthesiologist leaned over her. His eyes, visible above the mask, were kind but focused. "We'll start with a small sedative," he said. "You'll feel sleepy. We'll be here the whole time. Do you have any last questions?" Margaret wanted to ask 1,000. Would it hurt? Would she wake up? Would Emily ever know how deeply she loved her? Instead, she whispered, "Please take care of me. I have to see my daughter again." The anesthesiologist gave a reassuring nod. "That's our goal, Mrs. Harper. Sweet dreams." A cool sensation rushed through her arm as the medicine entered her veins. Her eyelids grew heavy, but her thoughts clung stubbornly to wakefulness. In those fading moments, her mind wandered. She saw Emily at age 7, running barefoot through the sprinkler in their backyard, shrieking with joy as water sparkled in the sunlight. She saw Daniel at 15, awkward and lanky, asking Harold for advice about his first job. She saw Harold himself, laughing at the kitchen table, the lines on his face deepened by joy. If this is my last memory, she thought, let it be enough. Darkness took her. When Margaret opened her eyes again, it was not to daylight but to a strange half-dream. She was not in her bed nor in her house. She was floating, it seemed, in a place that was neither here nor gone. In this dream space, she saw Harold. He looked exactly as she remembered. Strong shoulders, gentle smile, the scent of aftershave she once teased him about. He reached out his hand. "Mags," he said softly. "Am I?" "No," he interrupted, shaking his head. "Not yet, not your time. You're here because love brought you close to the line, but you're not finished." She felt tears sting her eyes, even in a dream. "I'm so afraid, Harold." He smiled, squeezing her hand. "Fear only proves how much you still want to live. And love is the reason you're here at all. Trust it, trust yourself, go back." His voice faded like waves receding from shore. Margaret awoke to the beeping of machines. The brightness returned, but now it was gentler. She was in recovery, her body heavy, her throat dry. She blinked slowly, trying to focus. Claire appeared above her, smiling behind her mask. "Welcome back, Margaret. You did beautifully." Margaret tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "It's done?" "Yes, surgery was successful. Your kidney is already en route to its recipient. The chain begins today." Margaret's eyes filled. A stranger, right now, was waking up with a part of her inside them. A stranger. Breathing because she had chosen to risk everything. Hours passed in a blur. Nurses checked her vitals, adjusted her Roman 4. Margaret drifted in and out of sleep, her body sore but her heart strangely light. At one point, Daniel sat beside her, his hand gripping hers. "You scared me, Mom," he whispered. His eyes were red. "But I'm proud of you." Margaret smiled faintly, too weak to speak, but her hand squeezed his back. Later, Emily was wheeled into her room, still fragile from dialysis but desperate to see her mother. They stared at each other, both pale, both weary, but both alive. "You're here," Emily whispered. "Of course," Margaret said. "I told you I'd always show up." Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. "Mom, I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Margaret said softly. "By being my daughter, that's always been enough." That night, alone in the dim hospital room, Margaret reflected. She had crossed the threshold. She had given what she could not retrieve. She had entered the point of no return, and yet she felt no regret. Pain throbbed through her abdomen, sharp and unrelenting, but beneath it pulsed something deeper, a quiet certainty that her sacrifice was not the end but the beginning. The chain had started. Somewhere a family was receiving news of hope. Somewhere another mother was crying tears of relief. And somewhere in the near future, Emily might finally get her chance. Margaret closed her eyes, whispering into the silence, "Let it reach her. Please let it reach her." And with that prayer, she drifted into the most peaceful sleep she had known in years. Recovery was supposed to mean rest, but for Margaret, recovery meant waiting. The surgery had taken a piece of her body, but it was the silence afterward that gnawed at her most. She lay in the hospital bed, the machines humming softly, her abdomen aching with every breath. Doctors reassured her. The procedure had gone smoothly, her vitals were stable, her strength would return in time. But strength wasn't what she wanted. She wanted answers. She wanted to know if her sacrifice had mattered. Had Emily been matched? Every knock at the door made her heart leap. Every shuffle of footsteps in the hallway seemed like it could bring news. But each time it was only a nurse checking her chart, or Daniel bringing her tea, or Emily sitting quietly at her side. On the second day after surgery, Emily finally spoke what had been hovering in both their hearts. "Mom," she whispered, fiddling with the hospital blanket, "what if this doesn't work? What if you gave away your kidney and nothing changes for me?" Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. Her own was pale and thin now, but steady. "Then at least I gave someone else a chance, and isn't that worth something?" Emily looked down, her lip trembling. "I don't want it to be worth something for someone else. I want it to be worth something for us." The honesty cut through Margaret like glass. She wanted to promise her daughter the world, to swear that the chain would come full circle, that salvation was already on its way. But promises built on uncertainty only deepen sorrow later. Instead, she said the only true thing she could. "I know, and I'm waiting with you." The waiting days were strange. Time bent, stretched. Mornings felt endless, afternoons slipped away in fog. Daniel brought newspapers, but Margaret couldn't focus on headlines. Emily tried to distract her with stories about friends, old memories, even gossip from the dialysis clinic. But beneath every word, the same question lingered. When? At night, Margaret dreamt of doors. Endless doors in a long hallway, each one locked. She carried a key, but it only opened one door, and she never knew which. She would wake with her heart pounding, her hand reaching for the call button, convinced the phone would ring with the answer. But it didn't, not yet. One afternoon, Pastor Lewis visited. He stood by her bed, Bible in hand, but his eyes kind and searching. "How are you holding up, Margaret?" She sighed. "It's not the pain that's hard, it's the waiting, not knowing if Emily will get her chance." The pastor nodded. "Waiting is one of the hardest faiths. We think of faith as action, as courage, but often faith is patience, trusting when you can't see." Margaret shook her head faintly. "But what if my patience runs out before her time comes?" He laid a gentle hand on her arm. "Then you remember, your act of love has already moved the world, whether you see its ending or not." By the fifth day, Margaret was discharged. Daniel helped her into the car, supporting her carefully as if she were made of glass. The ride home felt foreign, the streets familiar, yet changed, as though she had left part of herself behind in the hospital corridors. At home, she lowered herself into her favorite armchair by the window. The ocean view stretched before her, calm and endless. She had always loved the waves for their constancy, arriving and receding, again and again. Waiting for them to stop would be madness, yet waiting for a transplant felt exactly like that, praying for the tide to turn in their favor. That evening, Emily stayed overnight. She made tea, arranged blankets, fussed over her mother in a role reversal that almost made Margaret laugh. "You don't have to play nurse," Margaret said softly. "Yes, I do," Emily replied. "I don't know how else to say thank you." Margaret reached for her daughter's face, cupping her cheek. "You don't owe me thanks, Em. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "That you'll keep hope alive even when it hurts." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'll try." Days turned into a week. The phone remained silent. Margaret's body grew stronger, but her spirit frayed with each passing sunrise. She found herself lingering by the phone, as if her presence could will it to ring. One morning, she picked it up and held it against her chest, whispering, "Please, please call." And then, as if the universe had been listening all along, it did. The ringtone cut through the silence. Margaret's hands shook as she answered. On the other end was the transplant coordinator, her voice brisk but warm. "Mrs. Harper, I have news. A match has been found for Emily. She's scheduled for surgery within the next 48 hours." Margaret's breath caught. She nearly dropped the phone. Tears spilled down her cheeks as relief crashed over her like a wave. "Thank you," she whispered hoarsely. "Thank you." When she hung up, Emily was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with hope and fear. "What is it, Mom?" Margaret's smile trembled. "It's your turn, sweetheart. They found you a kidney." The waiting had ended, but the journey and the lessons it would bring had only just begun. It was nearly midnight when the second call came. Margaret had dozed in her chair by the window, the ocean waves whispering through the glass when the sharp ring startled her awake. Her heart raced, late-night calls rarely brought good news. She fumbled for the phone, her hands trembling. "Mrs. Harper, this is the transplant team." Her pulse quickened. She clutched the receiver tight. "We need Emily here immediately. A kidney has arrived. Surgery is scheduled for early morning." Margaret's knees went weak. For days she had prayed for this moment, yet now that it had arrived, the weight of it nearly crushed her. "I'll bring her," she whispered. "We'll be there." Within minutes, their quiet house erupted into motion. Emily stumbled into the living room, her hair mussed from sleep, eyes wide with fear and hope. Daniel, who had been staying in the guest room, was already pulling on his jacket. "They called?" Emily asked, her voice small. Margaret nodded. Unable to speak, her throat closed with emotion. She simply opened her arms, and Emily collapsed into them, shaking. "Mom, what if it doesn't work?" "It will," Margaret whispered into her daughter's hair. "And even if it doesn't, this is your chance. That's more than we had yesterday." The drive to the hospital was surreal. The highway stretched dark and empty, the world asleep while their lives shifted course. Streetlights flashed over Emily's pale face, illuminating the shadows under her eyes. She clutched a small bag with trembling hands, a sweater, a book she'd probably never open, a photograph of her and her mother from years ago at the beach. Margaret sat beside her, holding her hand the entire way. Daniel drove silently, jaw tight, headlights carving tunnels through the night. Nobody spoke much. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. Fear filled the silence, but so did gratitude. After months of uncertainty, they finally had something to hold on to. At the hospital, the pace quickened. Nurses whisked Emily into pre-op, checking vitals, inserting Roman 4 lines, reviewing consent forms. Margaret trailed behind like a shadow, trying to memorize every detail. The squeak of the nurse's shoes, the cool touch of the Roman 4 pole, the faint smell of antiseptic. When they reached the prep room, Emily turned to her mother. "Stay with me?" "Always." Margaret sat beside her daughter's bed, stroking her hair as doctors explained the procedure. Their words, anesthesia, rejection risk, post-op recovery, blurred together. What Margaret heard instead was a quieter voice inside. "This is it. This is the moment all the waiting was for." At 2 a.m., the surgeon entered. He was calm, reassuring, with the practiced demeanor of someone who had delivered hope to countless families before. "Mrs. Harper," he said, looking at Margaret, "the kidney we've received is a good match. There are always risks, but your daughter has an excellent chance." Margaret's lips trembled. "Thank you, doctor. Please bring her back to me." He nodded solemnly. "That's our goal." As the clock struck 3, the orderlies came to wheel Emily to the operating room. She clutched her mother's hand one last time, her eyes glistening. "I love you, Mom," she whispered. Margaret bent down, kissed her forehead. "I love you more. Now go get your second chance." The doors swung closed behind the gurney, leaving Margaret standing alone in the hallway, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The waiting room felt colder at night. Chairs lined the walls, the vending machine hummed, and the television played muted infomercials for products no one truly needed. Daniel paced the floor, hands shoved deep into his pockets. Margaret sat, hands folded tightly, her lips moving in silent prayer. Hours passed like centuries. Each time the doors opened, she sat up straight, only to slump back when it was a nurse with someone else's news. At one point, Daniel muttered, "Why does it have to take so long?" His voice cracked with frustration. Margaret answered softly, "Because miracles take time." Near dawn, the surgeon finally emerged. Margaret stood before he even spoke, her entire body braced for the verdict. "It went well," he said. Relief flooded his voice. "The kidney is in place, and it's already producing urine, an excellent sign. She'll remain in recovery for several hours, but right now, things look very promising." Margaret's knees buckled. She reached for a chair before collapsing entirely. Tears spilled down her face, raw and unguarded. "Thank you," she whispered, voice breaking. "Thank you." When she was finally allowed into the recovery room, Margaret tiptoed to her daughter's side. Emily lay pale and still, tubes and monitors surrounding her. But her chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. Margaret took her hand, careful not to disturb the Roman 4. "You did it, sweetheart. You're still here." Emily stirred, eyelids fluttering. "Mom?" Her voice was raspy, barely audible. "I'm here." A faint smile crossed Emily's lips. "Did it work?" Margaret brushed a tear from her cheek. "Yes, it worked." For the first time in months, Margaret felt a weight lift from her chest. She leaned closer, pressing her forehead against her daughter's hand, whispering words only Emily could hear. "You've been given back to me, and I promise, I will never waste a single day of it." That morning, as sunlight broke through the hospital windows, Margaret sat by Emily's bed, exhaustion pulling at her but gratitude holding her upright. The call in the night had brought fear, chaos, and sleepless hours, but it had also brought something else. A chance, a gift, a future, and Margaret, for the first time in a very long while, allowed herself to believe in tomorrow. Hospitals, Margaret discovered, had two kinds of time. There was fast time, the rush of nurses, the beeping of machines, the clipped words of doctors with too many patients and too little sleep. And then there was slow time, the endless hours in a chair beside a bed, where each breath of a loved one felt like a lifetime, where the second hand of the clock dragged like a heavy chain. Margaret lived in slow time now. Emily lay in the bed, pale but alive, her body adjusting to its new companion, a kidney that had once belonged to a stranger. Margaret sat by her side, keeping vigil, unwilling to leave even for meals. Daniel tried to insist she take breaks, but Margaret waved him off. "I missed too many moments already," she said. "This one I won't." The first 24 hours were crucial. Rejection could begin quickly, the doctors had explained. Signs to watch for: fever, pain, sudden changes in blood pressure. Margaret memorized every word, then turned her mother's eyes into instruments sharper than any machine. She noticed every flutter of Emily's eyelids, every twitch of her fingers. She counted the rhythm of her breathing, the rise and fall of her chest. She sat so close she could feel the warmth of her daughter's skin, reassuring herself it was still there, still alive. During the quiet hours of night, when even Daniel had gone home to rest, Margaret whispered stories into the dim room. She told Emily about the day she was born, how Harold had driven through 3 red lights to reach the hospital. She told her about the time she broke her arm climbing a tree, how brave she had been even as tears streaked her cheeks. She told her about prom night when Margaret stayed up late sewing the hem of her dress so it would be perfect. "You've always been strong," Margaret whispered. "Stronger than me, maybe. But even the strong need help sometimes. That's why I'm here. That's why I'll always be here." She didn't know if Emily could hear her, but mothers speak to more than ears. They speak to hearts. On the second night, a nurse entered to check Emily's vitals. She adjusted the Roman 4, scribbled on a chart, then gave Margaret a kind smile. "You should try to sleep, Mrs. Harper." Margaret shook her head. "I'll sleep when she's safe." The nurse hesitated, then said softly, "I've seen a lot of mothers sit where you're sitting. Some break, some fight. You're steady, that's rare." Margaret offered a faint smile. "Steady doesn't mean I'm not scared, it just means I won't move." By the third day, there was progress. Emily's color improved, her cheeks warming with a hint of pink. Her eyes opened more often, and she whispered short sentences. "Water?" she asked once, her voice raspy. Margaret held the straw to her lips, tears brimming as her daughter sipped. "That's it, sweetheart, slow and steady." Another time, Emily murmured, "Does it feel strange?" "What, darling?" "Having part of a stranger inside me." Margaret paused, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. No stranger would give away something so vital unless they wanted to be family. Whoever they are, they're part of us now. Emily's lips curved in a weak smile. "Family, I like that." Still, setbacks threatened. On the fourth morning, Emily spiked a fever. Alarms sounded, nurses rushed in, a doctor barked orders. Margaret's heart nearly stopped as she stood pressed against the wall, powerless. They adjusted medications, ran tests, hung new Roman 4 bags. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the fever began to break. The doctor turned to Margaret, his voice calm. "It happens sometimes. Her body is adjusting. This isn't failure, it's part of the battle." Margaret nodded, tears streaming freely. She returned to her chair, clasped her daughter's hand, and whispered, "We're still here. We're not giving up." Through it all, Margaret found herself thinking of the unknown donor. Somewhere out there was a person whose kidney now pulsed inside Emily. Had their family kept vigil too? Had another mother sat in another hospital chair, praying for the same miracle? Margaret whispered a silent thank you into the sterile air. "Whoever you are, you've saved my child. May someone be saving yours." By the end of the first week, the worst had passed. Emily sat up in bed for the first time, her hair messy, her body frail, but her eyes shining with something Margaret hadn't seen in months: hope. "Mom," she said softly, "I feel different, better. It's like my body isn't drowning anymore." Margaret's chest tightened. She reached out, cupping her daughter's cheek. "That's because life is flowing back into you, and I'll be here every step as it does." That night, Margaret finally allowed herself to rest. She leaned back in the chair, Emily's steady breathing beside her, the machines humming their quiet lullaby. Her body ached, her eyelids sagged, but her heart felt lighter. The vigil wasn't over. It might never be, not truly. Mothers keep vigil even when their children are grown, even when they're healthy, even when they no longer need it. But for the first time in a long while, Margaret realized she was not watching over the shadow of her daughter's life. She was watching over its return. And that made all the difference. The hospital corridors held secrets. Behind each door, stories unfolded, stories of fear, of loss, of healing. Margaret knew this, but she had spent so long focused only on Emily that she had forgotten there were other rooms, other mothers, other vigils happening at the same time. On the 8th morning after Emily's transplant, a knock came at the door. It was Claire, the nurse who had guided Margaret since her own surgery. "There's someone who'd like to meet you," Claire said gently. "Another family from the chain, if you're ready." Margaret blinked, her heart skipped. "Another family?" Claire nodded. "The man who received your kidney. His wife and daughter are here. They asked if they could thank you." Margaret sat frozen. For days she had wondered about them, the stranger who carried a part of her inside him now. She had prayed for him without knowing his name. And now, here was the chance to see them face to face. The meeting room was small, plain, with 2 chairs and a table. Margaret walked slowly, still sore from her incision, her hand pressed against her side. Her heart raced like it had on the day of Emily's birth, anticipation laced with fear. The door opened, and in walked a man in his 50s, thin, his skin still pale but his eyes alive. Beside him was a woman, his wife, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. Behind them, a girl no older than 16 hovered shyly, her eyes darting to Margaret with a mixture of awe and gratitude. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the man stepped forward, voice shaking. "You saved my life." Margaret's breath caught, tears blurred her vision. She reached out and he took her hands in his. His palms were warm, alive, pulsing with the blood of the kidney that had once been hers. "You're the reason my daughter still has a father," he whispered. Margaret's lips trembled. "And you're the reason my daughter might live to see her 30s." The words hung in the air like holy truth. The wife stepped closer, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We prayed every night for a miracle. We didn't know it would come from a woman we'd never met." Margaret squeezed her hands. "We prayed too. I suppose our prayers met in the middle." The teenage daughter, quiet until now, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was going to lose him. But because of you, I didn't." Margaret's heart cracked open. She pulled the girl into an embrace. "Then promise me you'll take care of him. Promise me you'll cherish every day you're given." The girl nodded fiercely, clinging to her. For nearly an hour they sat together, trading stories. The man's name was Robert. He had been a teacher for 30 years, loved history and gardening. His wife, Anna, had spent nights sleeping in hospital chairs, much like Margaret had. Their daughter, Lily, dreamed of becoming a nurse after what she had witnessed. In their laughter and tears, Margaret felt something profound. These strangers were no longer strangers. They were family, tied not by bloodlines but by sacrifice, by the invisible thread of a kidney that had crossed from one body to another, stitching their lives together. When the time came to leave, Robert looked Margaret in the eyes. "How can I ever repay you?" Margaret shook her head. "You already have. You gave my Emily her chance. That's more than enough." But Robert pressed on. "No, really. There must be something." Margaret thought for a long moment. Then she said, "Live well, love your family fiercely. And when you see someone in need, remember what was given to you and give something of yourself in return." Robert's eyes glistened. "I will, I promise." Back in Emily's room, Margaret recounted the meeting. Emily listened, eyes wide. "So, the man who has your kidney, he's alive, he's okay?" "Yes," Margaret said softly. "And he has a daughter about your age." Emily smiled weakly. "Then it's like we traded. His daughter gets her dad, and I get a chance at life." Margaret brushed her hand through her daughter's hair. Exactly. It's a chain, sweetheart, a chain of love. That night, as Margaret sat once more in her vigil chair, she thought of Robert and his family. She thought of all the unseen connections in the world, people helping people they might never meet, lives intersecting in ways too mysterious to plan. She whispered into the quiet room, "Thank you, God, for strangers who become family. Thank you for letting me see their faces." Emily stirred in her sleep, murmuring something Margaret couldn't quite catch. But her breathing was steady, her color warm, her life strong. And Margaret, for the first time, allowed herself to believe that perhaps this story wasn't just about survival. It was about belonging. It was 2 weeks after Emily's transplant when the letter arrived. The envelope bore the hospital's seal, the kind that usually made Margaret's heart tighten. She opened it with trembling hands, expecting lab results, instructions, perhaps a follow-up schedule. But inside was something she hadn't expected. A summary of the kidney chain her donation had begun. She sat at her kitchen table, the late afternoon sun slanting through the blinds, and read aloud to Emily, who was curled on the couch with a blanket. "Dear Mrs. Harper," it began, "we are writing to share the results of the paired donation chain initiated by your gift. Your willingness to donate has not only helped your daughter receive a kidney but has also impacted 4 additional patients." Margaret stopped, blinking at the words. 4 additional patients? Emily sat up straighter. "Mom, does that mean?" "Yes," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "It means 5 people in total are alive because of this." She read on, the words nearly blurring from her tears. "One kidney went to a young father in Ohio, another to a grandmother in Kentucky. A teenage boy in Pennsylvania received his transplant because of this chain, and a woman in her 40s in North Carolina, who had been on dialysis for nearly a decade, now has a functioning kidney." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. The letter closed with a simple line, "Your act of love has multiplied. Thank you for being the start of something extraordinary." She lowered the paper, staring at Emily as if to confirm it was real. "5 lives, Em, not just you, 5. Emily's eyes glistened. "Mom, you didn't just save me, you started a miracle." That evening, Daniel came by. Margaret handed him the letter, watching his face shift from skepticism to awe. "5," he said, reading it again as though the number might change. "I thought it was just about Emily." "So did I," Margaret admitted. Daniel sat heavily at the table. "Mom, I fought you on this. I told you it was reckless, dangerous, unfair, but I was wrong. You didn't just save Em, you saved families we'll never even meet." Margaret reached across the table, taking his hand. "That's the thing about love. You don't always get to choose where it lands, but it always lands somewhere." Over the next week, Margaret found herself imagining those other families. She pictured the father in Ohio tucking his children into bed, no longer tethered to a dialysis machine. She pictured the grandmother in Kentucky rocking her grandbaby to sleep, humming lullabies without the weight of sickness. She pictured the boy in Pennsylvania lacing up sneakers for the first time in years, running in the yard with friends. She pictured the woman in North Carolina tasting freedom after a decade of waiting. Each vision made her heart swell. Her gift had stretched across miles, across lives, across time. One morning, as Emily rested in the living room, Margaret brewed tea and stared out at the ocean. The waves rolled in steady rhythm, each one touching the shore before retreating into the vastness. That's what this was, she realized, a wave. She had pushed her love into the world and it had traveled farther than she ever thought possible. It had touched shores she might never walk. It reminded her of Harold. He used to say, "The best kind of legacy is the one you never see, the seeds you plant in someone else's garden." Now she understood. Emily grew stronger each day. Her cheeks filled with color, her laughter returned like sunlight breaking through clouds. She began to make small plans, finishing her degree, traveling again, even starting a support group for young transplant patients. One afternoon, she said quietly, "Mom, I don't want to waste this chance. If 5 people got their lives back because of you, then I want to spend mine giving something back too." Margaret's heart warmed. "That's all I ever wanted, Em, for you to live and to love." The hospital arranged a meeting for all the families in the chain, those who wanted to come. Margaret almost declined. She wasn't sure she had the strength for so many emotions, but Emily insisted. "Mom, don't you see? This is bigger than us. We need to see the whole picture." So on a spring afternoon, they gathered in a conference room at the medical center. One by one, families entered, a father holding his little boy's hand, a grandmother with a cane, a teenage boy grinning ear to ear, a woman with tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. When they were all seated, the coordinator spoke. "You may not know each other, but you are forever connected. One act began this chain, and today we celebrate the lives it touched." Margaret sat still, overwhelmed as faces turned toward her, smiling, crying, nodding with silent thanks. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a thread, woven into a tapestry far larger than herself. Later, as families mingled, Margaret found herself beside the teenage boy. He was tall, lanky, his hair messy in the way of youth. He grinned at her, awkward but genuine. "You're the start, aren't you?" he asked. Margaret chuckled softly. "So they tell me. Then thank you, I get to play basketball again because of you." She touched his shoulder gently. "Then play every game like it's a gift." That night back home, Margaret sat once more in her armchair by the window. Emily was asleep upstairs, her breathing steady, her life renewed. The ocean stretched endless and sure. She thought of Robert, of the boy, of the grandmother, of the woman, of the father. She thought of the invisible thread tying them all together, crossing state lines, hospital walls, family tables. One life had become five. One gift had multiplied. Margaret closed her eyes, whispering a prayer of thanks. "This was never just my story," she said into the quiet. "It was ours, always ours." Spring warmed into summer. The ocean outside Margaret's window glittered in the sun, waves rolling steady as always. But inside her home, life felt different, brighter, stronger, renewed. Emily no longer moved like a shadow of herself. She walked with energy, her cheeks flushed with color, her laughter rising from the kitchen as she burned her first attempt at baking bread. Margaret leaned in the doorway, smiling. To watch her daughter live again was like seeing a tree bloom after a long winter, fragile blossoms, yes, but blossoms all the same. One evening, Emily curled on the couch beside her mother. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the muffled call of gulls outside. "Mom," Emily said softly, "I think about it every day. The kidney inside me, the strangers who made this possible, you giving yours away. How do I ever live enough to honor all of that?" Margaret reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "By living at all, Em, by waking each morning with gratitude, by giving kindness where you can. That's all anyone can do. Life isn't about owing, it's about offering." Emily nodded, but her eyes glistened. "I still want to do something, something bigger, something that says thank you." Margaret smiled faintly. "Then make your life that thank you." A month later, Emily began volunteering at a transplant support group. She sat with patients tethered to dialysis, listening to their fears, their questions, their longing. She shared her story not as a miracle, but as proof that waiting doesn't have to be hopeless. Margaret watched from the back of the room, her heart swelling. Afterward, a woman approached Margaret. She was the grandmother from Kentucky, the one saved by the same chain. Her hands trembled as she held Margaret's. "You don't know me," she said, "but I know you. Because of you, I got to see my granddaughter graduate high school. I got to hold her hand as she crossed that stage." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Then it was worth everything. At home, Margaret began writing. Not letters this time, but reflections. Pages filled with memories, with lessons, with pieces of her heart she wanted her children to carry long after she was gone. She wrote about Harold, about raising Emily and Daniel, about the long nights of fear, the fateful phone call, the waiting, the vigil. She ended each entry with the same line: "Love multiplies when you let it go." One afternoon, Emily found the notebook. She flipped through, reading her mother's words, tears streaking down her cheeks. "Mom," she whispered, "this isn't just for us, this could help others." Margaret smiled. "Then promise me you'll share it, not for me, for the families still waiting, for the mothers still holding vigil." As summer ripened, they hosted a gathering at the beach house. Robert and his family came, along with the boy from Pennsylvania and his parents, the grandmother from Kentucky, and the woman from North Carolina. They ate under the open sky, children chasing gulls across the sand, laughter mingling with the surf. At one point, Robert raised a glass. "To Margaret, to Emily, to all of us." Proof that love doesn't stop at bloodlines and family doesn't end with walls. Everyone lifted their glasses. Margaret blushed, shaking her head. No, to life, to every messy, precious moment of it, and to the strangers who remind us we're never truly strangers. As twilight fell, Margaret sat by the water, toes sinking into cool sand. Emily joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. Do you ever regret it? Emily asked quietly. Margaret gazed at the horizon where the sun melted into the sea. Not for a second. Pain fades, scars heal, but love stays, and now it will outlive me. Emily rested her head against her mother's shoulder. Then I'll carry it forward. Margaret kissed her daughter's hair. That's the legacy, Em. Not kidneys, not surgeries, not even miracles. It's the love that flows through us into others until the world is a little lighter. That night before bed, Margaret stood by the window. Dolphins leapt in the distance, their bodies arcing in graceful unison. She thought of the kidney she no longer carried, now beating in Robert's chest. She thought of Emily's laughter, the grandmother's pride, the boys' basketball game, the woman's freedom. One life had become five. One gift had become many. She whispered into the night, "Hope is not a strategy. Love is." And with that, she turned off the light, carrying peace into her sleep, knowing that the legacy of love she began would ripple long after her last wave touched the shore.